Jim White. I asked him if it was senator, doctor, czar. We never got to the real, but I'm just going to say Jim White is the founding partner of Reality Check. His professional career started as a newspaper reporter. In many ways, he's never really let that go. He never lets it stop thinking that he isn't a journalist in everything that he does now. He digs to find the story, believing that the good research that he finds is like reporting. It's about finding the single most important insight and conveying it in a socially accepted and also compelling narrative. So let's welcome Jim White with Reality Check.
All right, thank you. There I am. All right. How y'all doing? Good afternoon. Thank you, Jennifer. I want to start off today by talking about what I see as a very fundamental question, and that is, what is an experience? We're talking about the customer experience here today, and I think it's important to define what we're talking about. I have been in the consumer insights business now for about 20 years. Something should be, there we go, there's the word. So my job is to measure stuff. And in order to do that, I have to understand what I'm measuring. So it's logical for me to want to know, what are we talking about when we talk about an experience? I think in the world of CX, oftentimes we want to measure what people do, right? What they do on our websites, what they do in our stores, what they do with our brands. That's one way, perhaps, that we define experience. We also talk about measuring people's opinions, like satisfaction, whether they're willing to advocate for us. But you might ask yourself, is evaluation really experience? Is behavior really experience? Sometimes we measure emotion. We want to understand how people feel at different moments in a decision journey or a path to purchase. But is emotion the same thing as experience? Now, you might argue that behavior and opinion and emotion are all part of how we would define experience as CX professionals, but it's not the whole story. And I use that word story very intentionally because there's some really interesting work that's been done in the fields of psychology and behavioral economics that suggests that we human beings experience our worlds through the lens of story. Experience for us is intertwined with narrative. That's how we make sense of our worlds, how we make sense of our reality. So increasingly, the more I think about this, the more I do work in this field, I've begun to define experience as the story of what happens, the story that our customers tell themselves about the experiences they've had. Experience is the story of what happens. Now, I know that Mark has asked us to talk about breakthroughs as sort of the theme for the day. My breakthrough in this area came really when I encountered the work of two thinkers, one of whom you've heard of, I'm sure. The second one I'm going to talk about you probably haven't heard of, but you should be aware of. The first one is Daniel Kahneman. We've heard Dan Kahneman's work referenced earlier today. His book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a watershed moment, I think, for many of us in the insights business. How many of you guys have read Thinking? Yeah? How many of you have actually read Thinking Fast? Right? If you were diligent enough to make it all the way to the end of Kahneman's book, you would have encountered a part of it where he talks about the two selves. Anybody get to section 5 and read about the two selves? The experiencing self and the remembering self. Now, the experiencing self is that part of us that experiences things as they happen, in the moment, in real time, if you will. But the remembering self, that's where the good stuff is. The remembering self is that part of us that takes those experiences we have, those experiences of our lives, everyday things, and makes meaning out of them. integrates those experiences into our belief systems, our value sets, and ultimately, it's the remembering self that dictates what we do, our behavior. As Kahneman writes, the remembering self is the one that keeps score. Love that. And governs what we learn from living, and it's the one that makes decisions. So the breakthrough for me in reading Kahneman and getting to that section of the book was this. I've spent a lot of time, a lot of years trying to figure out how to unobtrusively measure customer experiences. How do we get to that moment of brand interaction and measure all those triggers and touch points, big and small, conscious and non-conscious, unobtrusively? How do we do that? It's tricky, right? It's hard to do. It's also time-consuming. It can also be expensive. But when I read that section of Kahneman, it dawned on me, maybe we don't have to worry about all of that. Maybe we don't have to worry about tracking and mapping every little thing that happens to the experiencing self. What really matters, according to him, pretty weighty guy here, I think, is the story that the remembering self constructs of the experience. It's quite a breakthrough. That simplifies things. The research design that comes out of what Kahneman is suggesting is a very simple one. It's the stories that the remembering self tells about the experience. That's the really important thing to listen to, and the most important triggers and touch points are embedded in those stories. So Kahneman was the first epiphany for me. The second is a fellow that you probably haven't heard of. His name is Dan McAdams. He's the head of the psychology department right up here, up the street at Northwestern University. And McAdams has written about what he calls narrative identity, very similar to what Kahneman is talking about with the remembering self. McAdams' theory of identity construction is that we're all storytellers. We construct our sense of who we are by taking the experiences of our lives, everyday experiences, and crafting a narrative of our lives, of our existence. Our past experiences, what we're experiencing today in the moment, our future aspirations and ideals. All of these things get wedded into a narrative of the self. As McAdams says, another good quote here, it's easier for me to read this, isn't it? Yes, we're all tellers of tales. We each seek to provide our scattered and often confusing experiences with a sense of coherence by arranging the episodes of our lives into stories. Through our personal myths, each of us discovers what is true and what is meaningful in life in order to live well. With unity and purpose, we compose a heroic narrative of the self that illustrates essential truths about ourselves. So I encountered the work of both of these two fellows about the same time. And it really shed a lot of light on how to go about studying customer experiences in a way that was manageable, perhaps more meaningful, more accurate, and also simpler, more elegant from a research design standpoint. So I began and became fascinated with listening, eliciting, and analyzing customer stories, stories of experience. What do people remember? What do they recount from an experience shopping? And that could be a fleeting thing. It could be purchasing dog food yesterday, or it could be making a decision about an individual health insurance policy that spans a year, or choosing a college that even goes on for a longer process. What are the stories people recount of those episodes? Now, the challenge as a researcher, as you might guess, is that stories are kind of hard to analyze, particularly if you want to aggregate those stories in a way that allows you to extrapolate to a larger population. Individual stories, the lights are blinding me, so I don't know if you're here or not, but this fellow said, oh, so you're talking about collecting sort of anecdotes to bring customer journeys to life. And I said, no, you can aggregate this. Now, luckily, people smarter than I am have figured out how to do this. McAdams is one, but there are others that approach the analysis of stories through story arcs. If any of you have ever dabbled in screenwriting, anybody is trying to be a playwright on the side, you know what a story arc is. You can map and track the emotional flow of a narrative through a story arc. You can measure that. You can aggregate it. You can create aggregate story arcs of the experiences that customers have with your brands. And by doing that, you can understand the high points, the low points, the turning points, the resolution of those narratives. And embedded in those stories, in the flow, the emotional flow of that story arc, are the opportunities for brands to play a role in that narrative. You can begin to see where your brand can begin to influence the rising action, the falling action, the climax, the denouement, and the resolution of a story. So story arcs look like this. Here are a few from some recent work that we've done. I've stripped out a lot of the information here because it's proprietary, so I'm protecting our clients a little bit. But basically, these are what story arcs look like. These are individual story arcs from individual consumers, different shopping journeys. But you can begin to see the emotional flow of an experience. And what we look for in the analysis are those moments of rising action, falling action, climax, resolution. And when we see those in the aggregate, we can then go into the story data and see what people are talking about and look for those opportunities where our clients' brands have some effect over the process. What are the moments in this narrative where our brand can play a role in sending that story from a place of an emotional low point, perhaps, or a turning point, to rising action, to the kind of resolution that the consumer is seeking? I was talking about this to somebody else during a break, one of the folks from State Farm. I hope you're still here. And he asked, well, what's the benefit of this over just, decision journey mapping? And I think there are a couple of things. What's always bothered me about mapping decision journeys is that we are a priori defining a process as a linear, step-by-step thing. It's not always the case. And what Kahneman and McAdams are telling us is that the reality is not some sort of linear process in the consumer's mind. It's a story. Whether it's conscious or not, whether they express it or not, there's a running narrative in their heads about what happened. It's not a process, it's a story. So I feel like story arcs are more accurate, but they're also simpler. It frees us from having to worry about unobtrusively tracking and getting to moments of brand experience somehow. Now all we have to do is elicit stories. You have to know how to elicit them, you have to know how to analyze them, but it simplifies our ability to understand the customer journey a great deal. So, just to wrap up, I titled this presentation Shifting from CX to HX. The HX means human experience. And to me, that means understanding the broader context in which customer experiences happen, okay? If you wouldn't really understand what motivates people, and you're just researching the customer part of people, you're missing the whole context of what's really happening. This morning, Jeannie Walters talked about the customer ecosystem, and I love that idea. And what she was talking about is the same thing. There's this whole rich context of human life that surrounds the decisions we make as consumers. And I'm arguing that if you want to understand that rich context, if you want to understand the context in which those customer decisions are embedded, story is the pathway to that understanding, because that's how people express the experiences of their lives. So to make this transition from CX to HX is really a simple thing. All you have to do is listen to the stories that people tell. Thank you for your time. Unfortunately, I have to catch a plane. So if you have any questions for me, or you want to know more about the work that we're doing, just shoot me an email and we'll set up a time to talk. Thank you so much.